regardless of a person's level of belief, practice, etc., that soul, the belief in God, the innate and inherent belief in God that we're born with, you can't get rid of. My name is Rabbi Chaim Hanoka. I am the co-director with my wife, Chani, at Chabad of Pasadena, California. Today, we're going to be answering some big Jewish questions, so stay tuned. What are the three fundamental beliefs of Judaism? I would say, number one, fundamentally, one has to believe in God, an absolute belief in God. In addition, one should believe that the Torah is divine. It is not, quote unquote, something authored by man, God forbid. It was transmitted to Moses by God, and then on to Joshua, and obviously all the rest of the generations thereafter. But the belief in those two things in particular are absolute, believing in our righteous Redeemer, the Mashiach, the resurrection of the dead. Actually, the Maimonides has 13 principles of faith, but you only asked me for 3, so we'll keep it to that. Are there different types of Jews? Jews come in all shapes and sizes, from various backgrounds, origins, and what have you. So yes, there's Sephardic Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi Jews. The bottom line is, no matter where a person comes from, no matter what color their skin may be, and whatever their diets may be, notwithstanding, they all have a neshama, a Jewish soul, which comes from God, an actual part of God. So while it might be true that they have different customs and may look different one from the next, but deep down, we're all cut from the same cloth. What is the difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews? Basically, Ashkenazi Jewish food has no flavor, and Sephardic Jewish food has lots of flavor. Just ask any Sephardi. The underlying difference is that Ashkenazi Jews predominantly stem from Eastern Europe. Ashkenaz literally means an area of kind of Germany and parts of France dating back over 1,000 years. Sfard literally translates to Spain. Not that Sephardic Jews only come from Spain, but many of them do originate out of the Spain area, and then after the expulsion have been sort of disseminated throughout the world. But those are typically Jews from that region. What are some of the differences in terms of customs between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews and the like? There are various cultural differences in terms of their diets, what they eat, how they eat, etc. But beyond that, in terms of their actual customs, the liturgy of the prayer book is slightly different. Sephardic Jews traditionally have been much more traditional, I should say, traditionally more traditional. Over the years, just a lot of it having to do with the fact that much of the persecution that Ashkenazi Jews underwent, Sephardic Jews did not, and thus there was less, in the sense of splitting apart communities, as there was with the Ashkenazi Jews. So even if they weren't completely, Sabbath observant or kept kashrut, but there was always this underlying importance of religion and connecting to God, which I think is emblematic of many Sephardic Jews. To a large degree, many of the Sephardic customs are more Kabbalistically based than that of the Ashkenazic customs, and in turn have, I guess, more of a mystical twist to them in many cases. What role does gender play in Judaism? It actually plays a very important role. If you look at the beginning of the Bible, where it says that God made man and woman, Adam and Eve, or Adam and Chava, each one with a very specific role. And in reality, a man cannot do a woman's job, and a woman cannot do a man's job. Even though that may not be politically correct, but that's just the reality of things. Outside of the physiological differences, their purposes in this world differ one from the next. Their spiritual purposes, their means of serving God, etc. And each one is unique and, frankly speaking, an integral part of the puzzle, if you will, of the world, without which the world would not and cannot function properly. In terms of some of the spiritual differences between men and women are innately more spiritually inclined than men, which is why, for example, men wear yarmulkes. Why do we wear a kippah or a yarmulke? The word yarmulke is an aggregate of 2 words of Yerei Malka, which means the fear of the king, because men need a constant reminder that there's a God above them, that they don't run the world. And in essence, women don't necessarily need that reminder on a regular basis. The way God created man and woman obviously are different, outside of the physiological differences, but also in terms of our emotional connection to God. And men, generally speaking, need to work more so on their emotional connection to anything, frankly speaking. Ask many women, they'll tell you men don't have emotions. But notwithstanding, even when it comes to the emotional expression outside the intellectual expression to God, men have to work harder on it, in a sense. And women are gifted, in a sense, by God by being innately more spiritually connected than men, which obviates the need to fulfill all the same commandments that men do. As I said before, Men and women have very different purposes in the world. It's not a matter of better or worse, God forbid. On the contrary, one can't really survive without the next. Why do Jews cover their eyes during the Shema prayer? During the Shema prayer, you're affirming the oneness of God, what's in Hebrew known as Kabbalat Ol, accepting the yoke of heaven upon oneself by reciting the words, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, and the Lord is one. As this is one of the primary prayers in the liturgy of the Siddur, of the Jewish prayer book, we cover our eyes essentially to enhance our concentration so that there are no distractions whatsoever while those words are being recited. What is the Jewish view of Israel? The Jewish view of Israel is that Israel is our homeland, has been for thousands of years, as it was promised by God to Abraham and subsequently his descendants. And although we've been exiled multiple times out of our land, notwithstanding, it is still our land, has always been our land, and will always be our land. The Jewish land of Israel, in addition to being our land, is the holiest place in the world. Why is it the holy place in the world? Well, it has a lot of history. First and foremost, we know that Adam himself, the first man, Adam Arishon, was created on the Temple Mount, as it's known today, and many other biblical stories took place there, in addition to the binding of Isaac, amongst others. And needless to say, both temples, the first and second temple, were built on Mount Moriah, or what's called today the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But God essentially imbued the land of Israel with holiness. So the actual earth, the dirt, if you will, even the stones, anything in Israel is holy because God made it that way. And there is no other place in the world that has that same level of sanctity that was imbued with that spirituality by God. Why should I practice Judaism if I don't believe? Is being born into it the only reason? It is a primary reason. As much as a person may or may not believe in Judaism, listen, the reality is that Jews make lousy atheists. The old saying goes, is there no atheists in foxholes? So I would, in my experience, more often than not, Jews who, quote unquote, promote themselves as either being atheists, agnostics, it's to a degree. But deep down, the way God created every Jew, what makes us Jewish is that we have a neshama, a Jewish soul. And regardless of a person's level of belief, practice, etc., that soul, the belief in God, the innate and inherent belief in God that we're born with, you can't get rid of. So basically, it's part of your spiritual DNA. As you cannot change your physical DNA, you also can't change your spiritual DNA. And God created Jews as believers. Whether it is a concealed or latent level of belief or not would depend on the person. But notwithstanding, it's always there. And therefore, since you have a soul, you have a choice of either nourishing your soul or, God forbid, starving your soul. And as a human being, any healthy human being would not intentionally starve themselves. So then, obviously, one should try to, in a sense, nourish your soul as well, as your soul and your body are inexorably connected. So in terms of practicing when you don't necessarily believe, the reality is that practice brings belief. So while a person may not be perfect in the way they serve God, and most of us are not, it should not in any way, shape, or form stop a person from doing a particular mitzvah, whether it's putting on tefillin, lighting Shabbat candles, or whatever it may be, even if you don't necessarily believe in it, understand it, what have you. Often we don't believe in things simply because we don't know what they are. We don't really understand them. And if you understood the significance of it, your belief values may change. And even if they don't change, notwithstanding, actually performing the mitzvah will touch you, and that's a guarantee. What is Judaism's proof of God's existence? I would say intelligent design. If you look around the world and see, as much as you can see, the myriads of things that are happening every nanosecond and have to work completely in sync, without which the world would just kind of fall apart, to say it just happens surreptitiously or just kind of, natural, would be foolish. I mean, the fact that the sun rises every morning in the east and sets in the west is not by accident. The fact that the moon comes out at night and affects the tides, and amongst many other things, is not by accident. If you look at the human being, they've mapped the human genome. The way our genes have to work, or our DNA has to work within each other, I don't know how many cells we have, billions or millions, whatever it may be. And if, God forbid, some cells go awry, just a few out of millions and millions of cells, God forbid, it could be horrible for a human being. That they all have to work in sync, and they're created in such a way where they work in sync, to say that's an accident. There's a parable given, and I'll make it short, about a king who hired an artist, wants to come in and make a beautiful painting. So he gave the artist a sheet of paper, a bottle of ink, and a quill. The artist asked the king to walk out for a few minutes. He comes back, and there's this beautiful painting of a forest with streams and birds and trees. There's a beautiful depiction of a wonderful, tranquil forest. The king says to him, well, that's amazing. How did you do that in just a few minutes? So the artist says to the king, I didn't do it. The bottle of ink spilled, and it just made this painting. So the king says, well, how could that be possible? There's no way that a bottle of ink can spill and just miraculously make this beautiful painting. So in turn, the conversation evoked from there with the artist telling the person, ultimately the king, that this is obviously, the world also has to have an artist. The world doesn't just run by itself. All the beauty of the world and everything that exists in it has to have a creator and an artist to ensure that everything works seamlessly. So I think anybody who's honest with themselves can look at the world at large, the universe, and realize that there's got to be a conductor, there's got to be a creator that makes this all happen. It doesn't just happen on its own. What's the best proof that there's only one God? Historically, there have been many idolatrous nations, none of which in reality still exist today, at least in nations of old. And having prayed to the rocks, to the stones, to trees, to whatever form of idolatry it may be, has never really worked well for anything, because in reality, they're all limited and finite, and nothing but God is infinite. To describe God in any finite way, with any level of finitude, would obviate the concept of God being all-powerful or omniscient, omnipotent, and the like. So any form outside of the infinite God would not ultimately be God, because God cannot be defined in reality by any finite term. So in terms of what we call the nature of the world, God set up the world to work in what appears to us as a natural order, in terms of the sun coming out during the day, the moon at night, the stars, the constellations, and the like. But these are all created by God to work in a certain way, to appear to us as nature. But underneath that nature, there's still God that's constantly directing things on, and literally at every moment. We read this in davening, in the prayer we say, "Hamachadesh b'tuvo v'chayim tov ma'aseh v'rishis." God who renews with His goodness the act of creation on a regular basis. So even though something may have been created thousands of years ago, but it's constantly being imbued with godliness on a regular basis, without which it would absolutely disappear. It's almost akin to plugging in an appliance, if you will. As long as it's plugged in and there's electricity coming through the wall from the power station, etc., it's going to work. But the moment you disconnect that cord, the machine stops working. And in essence, we are constantly plugged into God. If God forbid for a moment, God said, listen, I'm tired, I need a break, I'm disconnecting, the entire universe, will return to absolute nothingness. Why doesn't God show Himself to us like He did in the Bible? There were times in history where God did these magnanimous miracles. For example, splitting the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, which has only been reenacted in the Universal Studios, to the best of my knowledge, but not quite with the same fanfare. But on a serious note, these great miracles happened because ultimately those generations needed to see those things. The world needed to see those things, in essence, to see the greatness, the holiness of God. Once that's been established, and has been established, there wasn't that need to do those same level of miracles again. God does not bring about these huge overt miracles for no reason. Each one is very specific to a specific time, to a specific people, and a specific place. There are miracles that happen on a daily basis. They're just not necessarily labeled as miracles, or they're not as magnanimous as the splitting of the sea or whatever it may be. Many wars have been fought in the name of religion. When does religion become dangerous? The religion itself is not dangerous. It's the people in some of those religions that become dangerous. And more often than not, where things are done in the name of religion, which are, let's just say, lackluster or dangerous, terroristic, what have you, it's often not the fault of the religion. It's the people who have misinterpreted or mistranslated things within the religions that sort of gives them the license to do what they do. But there have been studies done by experts to find out whether religion is good or bad for the world. And some of the readings I found, these are even secular readings, have found the fact that ultimately deep down religion is good for the world and not, God forbid, the contrary. Because religion ultimately gives people structure, and it gives them a belief in something greater than themselves, where Not everything is just subjective to my understanding, to man's understanding. If we all live based on only on our levels of understanding of the way life should be or could be, what I consider to be ethical or moral, then it's subjective to me. You may be completely different than I. If there's no standard per se, in this case, standard by God, then everybody does whatever they want, whenever they want, and all you have is nothing but chaos. There are some people in some religions who have taken some of their scriptural texts and used them as a reason to be violent. When a religion is so dogmatic to the extent where it's believed that if you don't believe in my religion and don't worship the way I do, then either you don't deserve to live, you're not going to be saved, you're doomed to hell, what have you, then there's a problem. But when a person is able to, in a sense, believe in God, irrespective of the religion they come from, and be a good, moral, and ethical person based on those religious values, it only brings more goodness to the world. If Judaism is such a spiritual religion, why are there so many physical rules? In reality, the spiritual and the physical work in tandem with each other. So whenever a physical act is being done down here, there's a spiritual reflex, if you will, almost like the butterfly effect, where butterfly flaps its wings in Japan and it rains in LA. This year we had a lot of rain. Must have been a lot of butterflies in Japan. But from a spiritual perspective, by doing physical acts, the way God created the world to be, and the way God created we as Jewish people, is by performing certain physical acts which may seem mundane to some, and like, why does God really care? But in the way God created the world, those acts actually make a profound difference. So as much as we live as a microcosm in a macrocosmic world, but the macrocosm is only made up of all those microcosms. And in essence, you can sort of visualize yourself as one piece of a puzzle in a multi-million piece puzzle. But if one piece is missing in a puzzle that may have 5 million pieces, and you look at that whole puzzle, your eyes are going to go to exactly the spot of this missing piece and not to the rest of the beautiful puzzle or mosaic. And in essence, our actions, our physical actions are what help to complete that puzzle piece and ultimately elevate the physical world that we live in, elevate the corporeal and imbue it with spirituality. The Hebrew Bible seems more like a history book than a guide for life. Why did God make it that way? Well, in essence, simply speaking, the genesis of anything or anyone is your history. It's what makes you who you are. But in those historical stories, which appear to be stories to us, you can read the Bible, at least parts of it, as just stories that happen beginning with the creation of the world, etc. But every one of those stories have very deep lessons, practical, pragmatic lessons, every one of us, as to how to live our lives on a daily basis. So even stories that happened thousands of years ago in a land that perhaps is unknown to you or to us or whatever it may be, notwithstanding every one of those acts that our patriarchs or matriarchs went through, or Adam or Eve or Noah, etc., all have a very deep meaning as to how we live our lives today and as to how we're meant to relate to the world and to God. In addition to the fact that the word Torah itself comes from the word hora'ah, which means lessons. So it's not just a history book. It's actually a book of lessons. For all intents and purposes, it is an instruction book. It's the blueprint, not just for the Jewish people, but it's a blueprint for the world as to how people are meant to act, react, etc. No matter who you are, no matter what generation you're from, the Torah does not have an expiration date. It is not like a coupon. The question is, why are there so many interpretations, differing interpretations in Torah when there's only one absolute truth? So the reality is that although there is only one absolute truth, and that's true, no pun intended, but God created every human being differently. No two human beings are the same. And in turn, our relationships with God also differ. For example, by nature, some people are more kind, compassionate, etc. Other people are a little more intense, severe, and whatnot, and which often goes along with discipline. So you have some people who are highly disciplined, and that's how they live their lives. And in turn, you have certain positions in Torah which are very disciplined positions. They seem like very stringent, severe. That works well for a certain element of the population. Many other people can't handle that. And therefore, their connection to God is more through kindness and compassion and the like. And often you'll find other opinions that would be more lenient and not quite as stringent. A classic example is the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel. We generally follow the opinion of Hillel, the great sage Hillel, because he took the more lenient route, for lack of a better term. And Shammai, or his house, the house of Shammai, his school, took the more stringent approach. But most people today in our generation, and so it's been true for a long time, cannot handle and not live their lives in such a disciplined way as the school of Shammai did. Although it does say that when Mashiach comes, a righteous Redeemer comes, and evil will be banished from the world forever, vanquished from the world, we will follow the opinion of Shammai. So in turn, there are many opinions. They're not really conflicting opinions. If you look at them in their essence deeply, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe was a master of being able to show you how in reality, although they may overtly look like different opinions, they're different approaches to, in a sense, fulfilling the same mitzvah. If God gave us the oral and written Torah, why did he not give us Kabblah, Jewish mysticism, at the same time? And where does that fit in? So the answer, simply speaking, is that God did give us Kabblah, quote unquote, Jewish mysticism, at the same time he gave us the Torah. In fact, if you look at the Ten Commandments, there are 620 letters in the Ten Commandments. What is that representative of? The 613 commandments and the 7 rabbinic ordinances that came about as well. They're all there mystically, Kabbalistically. In addition to the fact the whole Matan Torah, the whole giving of the Torah, with all the thunder and the lightning and God's voice booming through the world, what have you, these are all mystical, very mystical things, as well as many of the teachings. Now, they weren't written in the form of the Zohar, which came about some 2,000 years ago, or the Holy Lion, the Arizal, 500 years ago, etc. But notwithstanding, those teachings were already given to us simultaneously, frankly speaking, and are even earlier than some of the other written, quote-unquote, or oral aspects of the Torah. Why were they not put into written form until much later on? In our case, in the Chabad Hasidic world, beginning with the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, or the Alter Rebbe, the head of Chabad Lubavitch, is because, simply speaking, those generations didn't necessarily need those teachings so accessible as we need it today. And therefore, the unveiling or the revelation of these various teachings over the last few generations are integral to a large degree the degradation of our own generations, because spiritually we are not the generation of Moses, the generation of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the author of the Zohar, the Arizal, etc. The spiritual darkness that's out there in the world today is fairly pronounced, and in turn, to help combat those issues, we need something stronger, in a sense, like a stronger medication. In this case, it's a stronger spiritual medication to ensure that we're able to break through the last vestiges of this darkness and the exile that we are in today. And beyond that, there's actually a Kabbalistic book which predates the giving of the Ten Commandments called Sefer Yetzirah, which is known to have been authored by Abraham, our patriarch. So in terms of Kabbalah and other writings as well, many of which we don't have today, but notwithstanding, they're there, and they've been around really since the creation of time.